Ekpo Eyo, fighting for Nigeria's and African cultural heritage. In today's global debate on restitution of cultural heritage, African voices remain too often unheard. While museums negotiate the return of looted artifacts, the African histories behind these objects and the people who fought to preserve them are rarely acknowledged. African perspectives are too often silenced or sidelined in the global debate. This documentary centers one voice that spoke out early and with force. This is the story of Ekpo Eyo, a Nigerian archaeologist, scholar and cultural activist. He was a protector of Nigerian heritage and a fighter for Africa's dignity, its artistic legacy, and its right to define its own history. Through his life and work, we will uncover 5 key battles he fought, battles that still resonate today. First, the fight against illicit trade and the looting of African heritage. Second, the fight for recognition of African cultural achievements as equal to the world's great civilizations. Third, the fight to decolonize and Africanize museums and to preserve cultural goods on the continent. Fourth, and finally, the fight for restitution, the return of stolen artifacts to their home. This is the story of a man and the story of a continent demanding to be heard. Ekpo Eyo was born in 1931 in Calabar, Cross River State, Nigeria. It was still the colonial era, a time when Nigeria's cultural past was being excavated, exported, and explained to the world almost entirely through European eyes. Eyo dedicated his life to changing that, and he would become one of the continent's most influential figures in culture. His journey began with education. In 1960, the same year Nigeria gained its independence, Eyo earned a bachelor's degree in archaeology from the University of London. He continued on to Cambridge, completing his master's in 1963, and later earned his PhD at the University of Ibadan in 1974, marking him as one of the first Nigerians to rise academically in this field. However, Eyo's activities extended beyond academia, reflecting his commitment to applying scholarly knowledge in practical and institutional contexts. In the Department of Antiquities, Nigeria's official cultural heritage office, he started out as a field archaeologist. By 1968, he was appointed director, the first Nigerian to hold the position. For the next 2 decades, he shaped Nigeria's national heritage policies, museum development, and international cultural presence. Later, he became a professor of African Studies at the University of Maryland in the US. Throughout his career, Eyo was deeply connected to global institutions, as vice president of the Commonwealth Association of Museums, as expert for ICOM and UNESCO, and a founding figure in the West African Archaeological Association. From Cross River to Cambridge, from excavation sites to UNESCO podiums, Eyo's trajectory placed him at the center of international discussions on African cultural heritage, an area in which Western institutions had long played a dominant role. As director of the National Commission for Museums and Monuments from 1968 to 1986, Ekpo Eyo not only oversaw Nigeria's national heritage policy, he played a key role in defending Nigeria's cultural heritage. Because even after independence, Nigeria's cultural treasures were still under threat. Not from colonial soldiers, but from collectors, traffickers, and foreign buyers. In Eyo's words,
Nigeria is one of many countries which have lost more than half of their cultural property through the advent of foreign religions and governments.
The losses took many forms, through missionary destruction of traditional religions, through gifting practices, often under pressure, through colonial plunder, through scientific expeditions which removed objects in the name of research, and increasingly through illicit trade. By the 1970s and 80s, the illegal export of artifacts had escalated significantly. Priceless Nok terracottas and sacred objects were being smuggled out of the country and sold in Western markets. Eyo didn't mince words. In 1984, he warned,
"As long as there is a ready market in Europe and North America, the stealing will go on."
That's why Eyo pushed for stronger laws, both in Nigeria and internationally. This was not just a moral issue, It was about sovereignty. For Ekpo Eyo, Nigerian heritage was never just a national matter. He understood it as part of something larger, as African heritage and as world heritage. He believed in the power of cultural objects to build bridges between peoples. He stressed that the idea of shared heritage is a mutual one. When a colleague said,
"We live in one world, not simply a collection of nations. Why should we not have a share in the cultural heritage which belongs to all of us?"
Eyo challenged him.
The only thing wrong with this point of view is its actualization. In my experience, cultural artifacts seem to flow in only one direction, from the peripheries of the world, meaning the underdeveloped and underprivileged countries, toward the center, meaning the politically strong and economically powerful nations of Europe and North America, and not vice versa.
Then he asked a question that cuts to the heart of global inequality.
Can you imagine the British Magna Carta or the American Declaration of Independence in Nigeria? The French Eiffel Tower or the American Statue of Liberty in Abidjan, Ivory Coast, or Accra, Ghana? The British Crown Jewels or the American Liberty Bell being held in Mexico City or New Delhi?
He stood for a world where heritage connects people, where respect replaces dominance. One of Ekpo Eyo's most powerful tools in the fight for African cultural recognition was a traveling exhibition, Treasures of Ancient Nigeria. For the first time in history, the Nigerian government allowed a major selection of its most precious archaeological and artistic treasures to travel abroad, not as colonial spoils, but as ambassadors of African art. Over 6 years, starting in 1980, the exhibition toured the United States, Canada, and Europe, from Detroit to San Francisco, from New York and Washington to Oslo, London, Berlin, Hildesheim, and more. Visitors came face to face with the sophistication of Nok terracottas, the elegance of Ife bronze heads, and the regal power of Benin court art. And everywhere it went, the message was clear.
The African is seen in the eyes of Europeans, Americans, Canadians as a people without history, without art or science, which make up civilization. We have pieces here that are comparable, and in some of them even better, than Greek art. That is the whole point of this exhibition.
In the post-colonial decades, few figures shaped the landscape of museums in Africa as profoundly as Ekpo Eyo. As Director of the Federal Department of Antiquities, and later as Director General of Nigeria's National Commission for Museums and Monuments, Eyo played a decisive role in redefining what it meant to care for African heritage. But his vision reached far beyond Nigeria. Eyo served as President of the Museums Association of Tropical Africa, and later as President of the Organization of African Museums and Monuments, positions that made him a Pan-African authority in the protection of cultural heritage. For Eyo, the goal was not just to preserve the past, but to empower African institutions and professionals to tell their own stories. In 1987, he wrote,
Ministries of Education should introduce African studies into the school curricula, and the universities should intensify the search for more knowledge of the African past. More museums should be established where only a few or none now exist, and craftsmen still at work should be encouraged and protected. This alone can save the African past from obscurity and preserve our ancient works of art and handicrafts for posterity.
It was a call to action. Eyo understood that institutions needed to be built and people needed to be trained. That's why he led the continued development of the Regional Training Center in Jos, Nigeria, a program co-sponsored by UNESCO and the Nigerian government. Here, young museum professionals from across Africa were trained. The goal: to end reliance on European or North American institutions and build capacity on the continent itself. Through his work, Eyo helped African museums become more than colonial relics. He helped turn them into living spaces of knowledge, pride, and continuity. Among all of Ekpo Eyo's efforts to protect cultural heritage, the struggle for restitution stood out. In 1977, Nigeria hosted Festac 77, the Second World Black and African Festival of Arts and Culture, a landmark Pan-African gathering that brought together artists, intellectuals, and activists. But it was also a moment of confrontation with colonial injustice. Nigeria requested the return of the Idea mask, a 16th century ivory mask from the Benin Kingdom, now held by the British Museum. The mask had been looted during the violent 1897 British invasion of Benin. For Festac, it was meant to serve as the emblem, a symbol of resistance and of memory. The British Museum refused to return it. This episode marked one of the most public struggles for restitution in the 20th century, and it made clear that the battle ahead would be long. But that was just the most public demand. As early as 1968, at the ICOM General Assembly, he had called on Western museums with large African collections to return one or two significant objects, not as reparation, but as a gesture of goodwill. His proposal led to a formal resolution, but it was watered down in later discussions, its clarity replaced with general appeals and vague compromises. Yet Eyo believed in dialogue, diplomacy, and moral obligation. At a UNESCO expert meeting in Venice in 1976, he stated clearly,
"We see these objects as ambassadors of Nigeria abroad, but the nations that hold them must also show good faith and recognize Nigeria's claim."
The problem was that European and North American institutions showed little interest in compromise. Still, Eyo kept pushing. Through bilateral negotiations, targeted restitution claims, and even by stopping illicit auctions, he worked to reclaim what had been lost. Through his work, the struggle for restitution was no longer just about objects. It became about voice, visibility, and recognition for Nigeria and for Africa. Ekpo Eyo died in 2011. With his passing, the world lost a great guardian of Nigeria's cultural heritage, a fighter for the recognition of African cultural heritage and for restitution. Yet his legacy continues to shape the conversations of today. From his life and work in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, key aspects remain especially relevant. His fight against illicit trade and the looting of African heritage. His fight for recognition of African cultural achievements as equal to the world's great civilizations. His fight against Eurocentrism and for an African perspective on African cultural heritage. His fight to decolonize and Africanize museums and to preserve cultural goods on the continent. And finally, his fight for restitution. Above all, however, Eyo's early and persistent advocacy for restitution deserves recognition. His voice was among the first to articulate the call for the return of African cultural heritage, laying important foundations for today's debates. We owe it to history to acknowledge those who shaped the foundations of these ongoing conversations. As global discussions on restitution continue to evolve, the work Ekpo Eyo initiated remains influential, inspiring new generations to protect, preserve, and reclaim Africa's cultural heritage.